Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we are going to do a review of the Retroid Pocket Mini. Now I've had this handheld for about a week at this point, and I've been doing all sorts of testing on it, and so beyond just the initial impressions video that I released a few days back, this is going to be a final assessment. So if you are looking for a deep dive in terms of the controls and the ergonomics, I'll recommend that other video. I'll leave a link down below. In this video we're going to focus on two major things. Number one is what exactly you will get if you spend $200 to get the Retroid Pocket Mini. So in that case we'll talk about its features and performance, both the good and the bad. I also want to spend some time talking about the future of this device, because even though it has already launched and is shipping this month, there are still some things that are a work in progress. Now the second thing I want to focus on in this video is going to be whether or not this is a good match for you. Given its $200 price point, there are plenty of other options out there on the market, especially this year. So even though I do think this is probably the best 4:3 aspect ratio handheld on the market right now, there might be something else that's a better fit for you, and so we'll explore all those other options as well. Either way, I think we're going to have a great time going over the Retroid Pocket Mini, so grab a snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's knock out the specs. We'll start with the CPU. This is a Snapdragon 865. This is a somewhat older chip, but still very powerful and power efficient, as we'll see later on. It also comes with 6GB of RAM, as well as 128 gigs of internal storage, plus a microSD card slot if you'd like to expand that. We've also got a really impressive display. It is 3.7 inches with a resolution of 1280 by 960, and it is AMOLED. It also has a full front glass plate, so it has a bit of a bezel-less design. The battery on this is 4000 milliamp hours, and it is worth noting that it can charge up to 27 watts at once. It's pretty fast. And in terms of weight, it weighs 215 grams, or a little bit under 8 ounces. As far as connectivity, we have Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.1, and then also a 3.5mm headphone jack. And while I don't have any footage of me testing the audio here in this video, I did test it out myself, and that audio jack does work great. Now the operating system is a little bit complicated. It ships with Android 10. However, the company has plans to make Android 13 available for users who want to flash it themselves. In addition, we should be getting Linux-based support for this handheld very soon. We'll talk about that more later. And finally, the last thing worth noting is that we have Hall sensor analog sticks with customizable RGB lights around them. Now the Retroid Pocket Mini has 5 different color options available, and it's also selling for $200 plus shipping. It is also worth noting that we have the Retroid Pocket 5 coming out next month. This one is going to be $20 more, so $220 plus shipping, but this one is going to have a 5.5-inch AMOLED display with a 16:9 aspect ratio. So between the two, I would say the Retroid Pocket 5 is better suited for more modern gaming as well as for game streaming. Meanwhile, as I'll show throughout this video, the Retroid Pocket Mini is better suited for playing 4:3 content. Now the way we're going to frame this video is to break down each of the little things that I like about this device and some of the things that I don't like as much. And so each of these will be broken down by chapter, and we'll start with the first one here, which is the fact that it is small and pocket friendly. And I do think that the Retroid Pocket Mini deserves the name Mini because it is a relatively small handheld, all things considered. Over the past week or so, I've been taking it everywhere with me. It is small enough to be very portable. Now I did a bunch of size comparisons in my initial impressions video, but I think long story short is the fact that this is slightly larger than the last small handheld from Retroid. This one here is the Retroid Pocket 2S, and you can see that yes, this one is just a little bit wider. I think the easiest way for me to wrap my head around just the overall size of this device is to think of it like a smaller PS Vita, but a larger PSP. So if you've ever owned one of these older Sony handhelds, then you might have a feel for what this is going to be like in your pocket. At the very least, it is far and away smaller than something like the Steam Deck. In other words, the Steam Deck for me is a handheld that you keep at home and then maybe take it on travel every once in a while. Meanwhile, the Retroid Pocket 2S feels like something that is equally comfortable on the road as well as at home. Now, in terms of pocketability, I tested it out with shorts in my previous video, but in this one I wanted to check it out with some pants. And I did find that the best fit for this was actually in a back pocket as opposed to the front. And that's because it is a little bit tall and bulky compared to something like a modern smartphone. It'll definitely still fit in a front pocket, for example here with some straight leg jeans, but I do find it a little bit uncomfortable just to walk around with it in the front like this, and so yeah, I've mostly been putting it in the back. One other thing worth noting, given the smaller size of this handheld, I found that it actually does not get very warm. and ambient heat is usually a big issue when it comes to these smaller handhelds. Now I have noticed that it will get warm along the center line, but luckily that's not really where you put your hands, and so when you're actually playing a game, I've never had a moment where I felt the ambient heat. And honestly, that might be one of the biggest strengths of the Retroid Pocket Mini, because I can't think of another device that's this size and this powerful that doesn't get warm. So if you do live in a warmer climate, or maybe you're more sensitive to ambient heat like me, then this might be a dream come true. Either way, I think it's a great sign that the active cooling on this device works very well. Another key feature of the Retroid Pocket Mini is the AMOLED screen, which I think is pretty amazing. Now this screen is great in many ways. The first is just the fact that it's beautiful because it has these really rich and vibrant colors, and it also has those very deep blacks, which makes everything else just pop out of the screen. So no matter what type of game you're playing, maybe an old 16-bit system, these are going to look great. Even the more modern systems will also look very good. I personally really appreciate saturated colors, and that's one of my favorite things about this screen. Now also, like I showed in my impressions video, the screen gets very bright and very dim. And I think it's the brightness that really pushes me over the edge, because this is a handheld that you can easily use outdoors. And I think when you combine that with the portability of this handheld, it's an excellent fit. You can basically take it anywhere and still enjoy it. Not only that, once you're indoors, you don't have to get it very bright at all. For example, here, compared to the Anbernic RG Cube on the left and the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro on the right, you can see that it only requires about 30% brightness compared to the others, which both require about 75%. So that does give us a lot of room to work with, and it's also going to save you on battery life as well. Now this screen does have some downsides to it, and one of it is the fact that 3.7 inches just feels a little bit small for this shell. When comparing the screen sizes of 4x3 content between these two devices, you can see it kind of splits the middle between the RG Cube and the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro screen. And like I mentioned in my impressions video, I think I would have enjoyed this device even more if we had a 4-inch display. But given the fact that these companies work with off-the-shelf parts, they probably didn't have a 4-inch AMOLED display to work with. And so my guess here, with no insider information, is that they probably would have loved to do a 4-inch screen as well, but 3.7 was probably the largest they could get in AMOLED. Either way, it is a great screen, and honestly, when I'm actually playing it, I don't ever think to myself, man, I wish it had 0.3 more inches. The only time it really does come into play is when trying to play some of the higher end systems, because sometimes the text will get a little bit small. And I think the highest that I can comfortably go is with PlayStation 2. Some of this text will get small, but I still find it to be legible. Now the smaller screen does become a hindrance when it comes to 16:9 aspect ratio content. For example, here when comparing a Nintendo Switch game between the Retroid Pocket Mini and the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, you can see that there is a big difference between the two. And so even though this device is more than capable of playing things like PlayStation Portable, it does get a little bit squinty. And when it comes to certain Nintendo Switch games, for example role-playing games that have text on them like Octopath Traveler, this is basically illegible for me. And so unfortunately, this is just a game that I don't think I could play on this small of a screen. Another time this comes into play is with certain Android games. For example, with Zenless Zone Zero, this game runs great, but it is hard to see some of the things on the screen. And that also makes sense because this is an Android phone game, and no phones really have screens this small anymore. So when it comes down to it, I tend to prefer 4x3 content games, basically all the way up to PS2, all of those seem to be fine. And there are some systems with a wider aspect ratio than 4x3 like Game Boy Advance that also look perfectly fine as well. Okay, the next thing I really like about this device is the battery life. Now generally when I'm testing Android-based devices, I don't sit down and test like individual games and see how they run. Instead, I usually will take it holistically based on a week or so of testing and various types of games that I play. And I found that the battery life here is about the same as it is on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which has a 1000 mAh larger battery. And what this generally means is when I'm really trying to push it, like a high-end Android game or maybe PS2 with the high performance mode on, that'll give me around 3 hours of gameplay if I'm just doing that. However, in a mixed use scenario, which is typically what I will play, I can usually get somewhere between like 5 or 6 hours. And if I was only to focus on really retro stuff, you know, like Super Nintendo games, that could last upwards of like 8 to 10 hours instead. Now to give you an idea of the metrics here, we're going to run the wildlife stress test. This is a 20-minute loop test, and I'm running it on both the Retroid Pocket Mini and the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. Now the final results are not super exciting. They are almost the same, 4693 with the Mini and 4494 for the 4 Pro. So this does give me an indication just based on raw performance power that they're about the same. And bear in mind, these are also running in high performance mode with the fan cranked up to max. Now there are a couple interesting things when you look at the performance monitoring section. The first is that the overall temperatures in the Snapdragon 865 are quite a bit lower. The max temperature that it reached was 34 degrees Celsius as opposed to 43 degrees on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. Now honestly, both of those numbers are great, so that's not a big deal, but the other thing that was really interesting is the amount amount of battery that was lost over that 20-minute period. On the Retroid Pocket Mini, it was 12%, whereas the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, it was 13%. And again, as a reminder, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro's battery is 5,000 milliamp hours, whereas the Retroid Pocket Mini is 4,000. So what this means is that even though the battery on the Retroid Pocket Mini is smaller, it's still more efficient when it comes to battery life. And if you do the math, 12% battery over 20 minutes means that you're going to get somewhere between 2.5 and 3 hours of battery. And that does fall in line with the worst case scenario that I mentioned earlier. So long story short, when it comes to battery life, this is about at that threshold where I really don't have to worry about it. To put it another way, most GameCube and PS2 games don't even require you to change it from the standard performance mode. And when playing games in just the regular performance mode, yeah, somewhere between like 4 or 5 hours with PS2 and GameCube, and I think that's great. So now let's move on and talk about performance. Now I went through and I tested every single system like I always do, and even though I did talk about each of these a little bit in detail in my impressions video, we're going to just focus on performance here in this video. As always, we'll start with the lightweight systems and work our way up. We'll start with Game Boy and Game Boy Color. And as expected, there's no issue whatsoever when playing these games. You can basically play them forever. These are 10:9 aspect ratio systems, which means you will get black bars on the left and right on a 4:3 display. But I think that pillar boxing is relatively minimal, all things considered. Moving on to Game Boy Advance, this one also is not a perfect match for 4:3. You will get some letterboxing on the top and the bottom. But I also think that those black bars are relatively minimal on a 4:3 display, and so I think this is also an excellent way to play Game Boy Advance. Now, none of these handheld systems have a perfect integer scale, which means that you will have to use some sort of interpolation shader just to balance everything out. But because we have so many pixels to work with a 1280 by 960 resolution, and we've also got a bunch of power to throw whatever shaders we want, it's not really that big of a deal at all. Now, moving over to the home console systems, things like Nintendo, Genesis, Super Nintendo, as expected, these will also play very well too. And like with the other systems, these are not perfectly integer scaled, but it is an easy fix once you figure out how scaling and shaders and all that work. By the way, I just recently made a guide talking about all that stuff, and so I'll leave that link down below if you haven't checked it out already. But long story short, in terms of performance, there's no issue with these home console systems, and I think they look gorgeous on that AMOLED display. And because we have so much power under the hood, we can easily manipulate the screen to add CRT effects and so on. Next, let's talk a little bit about arcade. Now, most of your classic arcade systems, all the way through the 80s and 90s, those will play just fine. After all, these games will usually play on a lot less powerful hardware. But there are some benefits of having a high-end chipset within a gaming handheld. For example, this one can play Killer Instinct at full speed. And this game in particular is rather hard to play on Android, so it's pretty cool to see a retro handheld this size that can play it very well. Now let's move on to our 3D-based platforms. We'll start with PS1. Now this one I am upscaling within DuckStation at a 4x resolution upscale. And I think all you really need to see right here is Tekken 3, because this one is playing at a resolution higher than the screen and it's still playing at full speed. Now a 4x resolution upscale will mean different things for different games because they each have their own resolution. And for my part, I just usually keep it at this 4x resolution upscale, and sometimes the pixels are a little bit chunkier than the others, and I don't really mind that with PS1. Regardless, the Snapdragon 865 in the Retroid Pocket Mini will be able to handle any PS1 game you try, no problem. It's going to be a similar story with Nintendo 64, but this one within RetroArch does have the ability to upscale it specifically to this screen's resolution. And every Nintendo 64 game that I tested at this 1280 by 960 resolution played at full speed within RetroArch. Same thing with Dreamcast. Within the Flycast core settings in RetroArch, you can also set that resolution to 1280 by 960. And same thing here, every game that I tested played at full speed, and it was a wonderful experience. So if you are a big Sega Dreamcast fan, you want to play these games with an OLED display, this might be an excellent fit. It's also a very similar experience with the Sega Saturn Beetle core within RetroArch. This is one of the hardest cores to play, and the fact that it's running on an Android-based device is really promising. This means that most of the games that run with this emulator will be very accurate, and everything I tested worked really well. So if you are looking to play your favorite Sega Saturn games with the Beetle core, chances are they're going to work at full speed here on this device. Also bear in mind that these are all playing in the standard performance mode, so I haven't even bumped up the CPU at all. Next, let's talk about some of the higher-end handheld systems. We'll start with PSP. Now this one is a native integer scale of 3x resolution, and so it does look very nice and crisp. The main issue that I have with this one, much like with any other 16:9 content, is that it does look a little bit small. So even though PSP does run especially well on this handheld, there are other handhelds I'd rather play PSP on. Another great example is going to be Nintendo DS and 3DS. These dual screen systems I don't think are a very good fit for a 4x3 device like this with a smaller screen. No matter how you try to arrange the screens, either side by side or top and bottom, or maybe making one a little bit smaller, none of them seem to be ideal. It just makes all the screens too small in my opinion. The only way I've found to make this playable, at least for me, is to only show the top screen. And that of course is going to limit the type of games that you can play, basically anything where you don't need to see that second screen at the same time. So if there are some games within the 3DS catalog that you want to play that fit that bill, then yes, the performance here is great. Most games will actually play at a 4x resolution upscale with 3DS. It's pretty impressive. Also of note, the Retroid Pocket Mini does have a gyroscope, and so games that support motion controls like Super Monkey Ball 3D will work on this device. But also bear in mind that not every 3DS game is going to run at full speed. Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, even at a 2x resolution, does not quite get there. And so this is not going to be able to play every 3DS game, and like I mentioned before, it's a pretty compromised experience just by the nature of this single screen. Now let's move on and talk about Nintendo GameCube, and long story short with this is that you can basically play every game that you can think of at a 2x resolution. There might be a few choice games that have some emulation struggles, but otherwise I think that most every game is going to play great. And I think looking at the Dolphin statistics is a great way to see just how powerful this handheld is. On the top right you can see the speed, that means the game is playing at 100% speed, but below that you can see the max. And that's showing how fast it could go if it needed to. And again, this is in standard performance mode, and you can see that it's about 200% with a 2x resolution of Burnout 2. If we bump that up to high performance mode, it gets closer to 275 or 300% max speed. And what this means from a gameplay perspective is that we have a lot of headroom to work with even at a 2x resolution upscale. And so I did find that every Nintendo GameCube game that I tried at a 2x resolution in standard performance mode played pretty well. There are going to be a couple games where you'll have to maybe drop down the resolution to native in certain parts, or you may have to turn on high performance mode, but those moments are very few and far between. To put it another way, when I was testing the GameCube, it became mostly an effortless experience. In fact, I tried my hardest to find games that gave it trouble, and it actually was not that easy to do. And that's exactly where I want to be when emulating these systems. Generally, that means I don't have to fiddle with the settings, I can just grab a game and start it up and it's going to play fine. There are always going to be games that have some sort of issues, maybe with some emulator compatibility, but for the most part, I've found that all the games that I tested were pretty great. Maybe one of my favorite experiences was testing out Tales of Symphonia. This one would have a hiccup every once in a while when like going between the world map and a battle, but otherwise it was a very smooth experience, and I really enjoyed playing through this game back in the day, and I think it's about time for me to maybe start up a new save game. Now all I have to do is finish the other 100 games that I need to finish before this one. Now moving on to Nintendo Wii, it's a very similar experience, again at a 2x resolution and most of the time running in the Vulkan backend and then sometimes OpenGL if the game required it. One thing of note here is that within the Wii settings in Dolphin you do have to turn off the widescreen mode so that way it will show in 4x3. And most games will support both widescreen and 4x3, so this is great because you can play everything at a native aspect ratio. The only game that I saw with some significant pauses was Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. This is a game that's known for having some shader compilation stutters, especially when you do some of those bigger moves. But after playing a couple rounds, anytime you do those moves, it actually gets a little bit better, and so I would say this is also a playable experience. Okay, so next up we're going to try out PS2, and this is a very similar experience, but I did find a ceiling at least with this emulator. Now for all my testing, I'm going to be using Neither SX2 in the 4248 version. I made a whole video about Neither SX2, I'll leave it linked down below, but long story short, there are two versions of this emulator. And I found that 4248 usually will have the best compatibility, but it does require a little bit more juice. And so I do think this is the best fit for this emulator all around. Now up in the top you'll also see the resolution upscale that I'm using with this device, and you'll see it alternate between 2 and 2.25. And that's because my first day of testing with PS2 I just kept it at a 2x resolution, but then after that I pushed it up to 2.25. And that's because that resolution is actually a little bit higher than what the screen can handle, which means that we're going to be pushing all the way to all the pixels. And also of note, all the hard games I tested on the second day, so all the most difficult ones are still at a 2.25x resolution. And if you've been following along to the footage, you have found that all these games are playing at full speed. Every once in a while you might get a little bit of a hiccup, but I would say it's not game-breaking in any way. And as you'll see from the games as we go through, many of these are the most heavy-hitting games in the PS2 library. I put out a couple calls for people to give me game requests, and so I tried to answer as many of those as I could. And so I am kind of speeding through some of these games, and that's just because these all do play well, and I wanted to show that I did test them first. So let's talk about some of the games where I did have to make some adjustments beyond the default settings. Let's start with Champions of Norath. This one I had to set to a 2x resolution. 2.25 was a little bit too much. But even then, in this opening scene, you can see that it is playing at full speed. Now I know that in some later scenes it might get a little bit harder, and so you would have to drop this down to maybe 1.5 or 1. Either way, I would say this game is playable on the Retroid Pocket Mini. Now for Shadow of the Colossus, I found that in the open world environment, I could run it at a 2.25x resolution and it looked great. However, when actually encountering the first Colossus, I did have to drop it down to a native resolution, but once I got there, it did play really well. This game is a little bit muddy looking at a native resolution, but thankfully with a 3.7-inch screen, you don't really see a lot of that pixelation. So again, I would say this is probably a playable game, although I never really made it past this first Colossus. Now when it comes to Need for Speed Most Wanted, I did have to make some adjustments. For example, I set the blending accuracy to minimum and then also turned on texture preloading. In addition, I did have to drop it down to a native resolution, but once I got to that point, yeah, the races were playing at full speed. Some of the menus did have some slowdown, but overall, I would still say this game is playable. Now, another one that a lot of people have questions about are the Sly Cooper series. And these are also interesting because the Neither SX2 4248 version that I'm using usually does not play these games very well. Instead, you usually have to use the other version, 3668 instead. But I did find that with both Sly Cooper 1 and 3, I'd get a little bit of slowdown, but I would still consider these games to be playable, at least at a native resolution. And the fact that they're running this well on version 4248 of Neither SX2 says a lot. Now, it's not all perfect. For example, in the opening scene of Sly Cooper 2, you can see that it is dipping quite a bit when you're on the model. And so it does alternate between 100% and then 90 and sometimes 80% speed, and so that is quite a bit slow. But to give you a contrast, that is still way better than the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which in that very same scene only will give you about 20% speed with version 4248. And so I think this is a great example of just how more effective the Retroid Pocket Mini is because of that Snapdragon chipset. Now, it's not all perfect. For example, with Dirge of Cerberus, this one did not play at full speed. But also bear in mind, this one struggles to play on the Odin 2, which cost $100 more than the Retroid Pocket Mini. One other interesting flaw I found was that NBA Street Volume 2 really bogged down. Like, it was only playing at like 80% or sometimes even 60% speed when trying to play just the first level. And again, this is at a native resolution, so this was pretty shocking. Thankfully, it's a very easy fix. All you have to do is just run the GameCube version of this game. It'll run at a 2x resolution with absolutely no problem. So even though an NBA Street Volume 2 is not a great time on PS2, it is excellent on the GameCube version. Long story short, when it comes to PS2, I was very impressed. Again, I tested about 50 games altogether, and among all the games that I played, I only had a few incidences, which I talked about here. Other than that, it was a very plug-and-play experience with PS2, which again is exactly where I want to be when it comes to emulation. Now, moving on, I did test one other high-end system, and that was Nintendo Switch using an Android 10 fork of Yuzu. Now, this one I played in handheld mode, but most of the games that I tried did play pretty well. To give you an idea of the upper limit, I found that Hades was just about there. I would get slowdowns every once in a while, but I would consider this game to be playable, at least from a performance standpoint. The big issue here is that playing these 16:9 games on a 3.7-inch screen with a 4:3 aspect ratio is just a recipe for disaster. It gets really hard to read any of this text, even within Hades, but even more so when trying to play a role-playing game. And I think it's a shame because a lot of these lightweight role-playing games would be an excellent fit for a small device like this, but it just so happens that this screen is not a very good fit for this type of game in particular. So honestly, I don't really see myself ever playing any of these Nintendo Switch games, but it is nice to see that they can run. And these games will probably run even better when we can upgrade to Android 13 with this device because we have more emulators that we can work with. That includes updated versions of Yuzu as well as Cemu, which is for Wii U emulation. Okay, and finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about in the performance section is the fact that you can use this for game streaming if you want. For example, here I'm connected to a computer over my local network and it's running Steam Link. So now I can control my computer, navigate through my games list, and then launch them on the device. And your experience here is going to depend on what the game supports. And so some of these games will support a taller aspect ratio, and so it's going to look a little bit better on this 4:3 display. In fact, there are some games that have 4:3 scaling, like Garfield Kart. So if you really want to play this game with a full screen resolution, you can definitely do it via Steam Link. But I would say for the most part, these games are going to run at a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is going to give you letterboxing at the top and the bottom. One other thing worth noting is that I don't find a modern control scheme where you're using dual analog sticks as well as your triggers to be very comfortable on the Retroid Pocket Mini. And a lot of this stems from the fact that we have 2 analog sticks on the bottom of the device and not a lot of support under it. Now, this device does have ergonomic grips, which makes it a little bit easier to play this style of game, but I still found it to be, as a whole, uncomfortable compared to something like a PS4 controller, which has those big grips at the bottom. So long story short, you can play these type of games, but again, I think that I'm personally just going to be focusing on things like PS2 and below. Okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about in terms of things that I like about this device is the fact that you can turn it into a retro gaming console for the most part. Now, I'm using a pretty wonky setup. I've got my Steam Deck dock, and then I also have the Retroid Pocket Mini turned upside down. And that's because I need to be able to expose the USB-C port so I can plug it in. I have ordered one of those Retroid Pocket docks, but it just hasn't come in the mail yet, and so once I have that, I'll also test that out later. But as you can see, it does work out very well. This dock is not only plugged into the monitor, but it's also charging it and also connected via Ethernet. I've also paired it with my 8BitDo SN30 Pro via X input, and it's working really well. So when it comes to playing things like within RetroArch, I didn't have to remap the keys at all. The controller just knew what to do and all the buttons worked accordingly. And so this will be an excellent fit if you are going to be playing some of these more retro styled games. You know, basically everything up to Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, as well as Sega Saturn, all those will run in RetroArch, and so they'll look great. And you're not going to have to remap the controls, which is awesome and kind of rare with an Android. Now, when it comes to PS2 and GameCube, you will have to remap the controls. There are certain profiles you can use, so you can kind of swap between the two, but it's not going to be seamless like it is with RetroArch. However, there are some added benefits to this. For example, you can upscale it even more than what the native resolution can handle on the screen. So for example, here with Ridge Racer 5, I'm running it at a 3x resolution, which is well beyond the screen capability, but it is playing great on my monitor. Or for example, here with Tekken 5, I'm running it at a 4x resolution, which is beyond 1440p. And so this is great to be able to upscale it to a higher resolution when showing it on a bigger screen. However, one thing I've noted within the Android 10 build that we have right now is that the video output is limited to a 4:3 aspect ratio. So even when playing on a 16:9 screen like I am right now, it's not going to go beyond that 4:3. This means when playing an Android game like Horizon Chase, it's going to be truncated on the left and right. And when you play a system that's 16:9, it's not going to scale all the way to the limits of the display. Instead, it's going to stay within that 4:3 aspect ratio. That means you're going to have big black bars on the left and right and top and bottom. Now, if you turn on developer options within the Android settings, you can force desktop mode, which will show on an external display. However, the desktop mode is also expecting you to have a mouse and keyboard, and so you can't actually control it from the device itself. This means if you want to show your games in 16:9 on an external display, you'll have to plug in a Bluetooth or USB mouse. And personally, I think that takes away from the whole retro console feeling of the Retroid Pocket Mini. Now, we'll probably have additional options when it comes to Android 13, but at least for now, we are a little bit limited within Android 10. In other words, if you're just going to be plugging this into an external monitor, I would say that your best bet is to play 4:3 content. Okay, one other thing I like about the Retroid Pocket Mini, and really any other Retroid Pocket device, is that they are fairly easy to mod. For example, if we go to their website, there is a DIY section, and here we've got a couple different options of things that we can use to customize our device. We've got different colored D-pads and A, B, and XY buttons, and a full button set as well. And so depending on the color scheme that you get, if you want to switch it up a little bit, you've got a lot of the tools available on their website, and they're relatively cheap. However, of note, the Retroid Pocket 5 is the only device that has clear backplates available. I think in my impressions video I mentioned that you could get them on their website, but it looks like, yeah, it's only for the RP5. So there are some limitations in what you can buy, at least directly from Retroid, but there are also community solutions on Etsy as well. Now, taking the device apart is pretty easy. There are just 4 Phillips head screws on it, and then after that, you just need to use a guitar pick to go around and undo all the clips. And here's a look at the internals after you've taken off that back plate. Now on the left and right, you can see we have a shield covering over the controls, and this is also easy to take off. It's just 4 Phillips head screws. And so this is what it looks like when you take off that plate. And so this is how you would swap out the analog sticks or change out the buttons. You would just pull out this controller board right here. And so as long as you don't mind using a screwdriver to open up a device, you should be able to make the mods yourself. It's a pretty easy process, and I do like that. And finally, the last thing that I really like about the Retroid Pocket Mini is the fact that it's still a work in progress. Now, I think some people might see this as a negative, but I personally see it as a way of showing that this device is already good and it could get a lot better. Like I mentioned before, this device ships with Android 10, which means it's basically going to function as a small tablet or phone. You're going to have to install all your emulators and games on it, and then configure everything and then set up a front end. And I've got videos about that. I'll also leave my Retroid Pocket guide down below. And like I've mentioned a couple times in this video, there are some limitations with Android 10. In particular, there are some emulators that only run on Android 11 and higher. So if you are looking for the latest and greatest when it comes to Android, you can flash this to Android 13 when Retroid makes it available. But I think personally the most exciting part about this chipset is the fact that it's also Linux compatible. In fact, for several weeks now, Retroid has been teasing the fact that they've got Batocera Linux running on the Retroid Pocket Mini. Now, the company themselves are the ones that made the changes to the official Batocera build to make it work with the Retroid Pocket Mini. And so they've mentioned that they are going to release their version of Batocera in the next month or so. But I think the most exciting thing is that those changes that Retroid have made for Batocera have actually been merged into the official version of Batocera as well. This means we might see an official release and support from the actual Batocera team. And I think that's a great thing because I'd rather have the actual Batocera team working on this build as opposed to an unofficial fork from Retroid. That allows the company to focus on the hardware and the software devs to focus on the software. So that's already exciting that we'll be able to get Linux working on a device that was originally made to run Android. Now, the other exciting part about that is that Retroid is working with community developers and sharing source code and everything. In fact, the team behind Rocknix, which is a Linux-based operating system also focused on retro emulation, has already got a version of their software booting on the Retroid Pocket Mini. And this means you'll be able to dual boot both Linux on an SD card as well as Android on the internal storage. And that's exciting for a couple different reasons. The first is that these Linux-based distros are much easier to configure. These operating systems already have the emulators pre-installed and already pre-configured, so all you have to do then is just drag and drop your ROMs. That's going to make the setup process a lot easier than it is on Android. The other part is that Linux opens up a whole new world of other games that you can play. For example, the main developer of Rocknix just released a video today showing the original Xbox booting on the Retroid Pocket Mini via Rocknix. So this means that we'll be able to play stuff like the original Halo directly on this device, and I never thought that would be possible. I think that is super awesome. Not only that, all of the drivers that they have to work with on the Linux side are actually very advanced. So they've got OpenGL 4.6 and Vulkan 1.3, which means that we may have performance parity between Android and Linux on this device. In other words, we could see PS2 and GameCube performance that matches what we saw on Android earlier in this video. In addition, they've already got Portmaster working on the Retroid Pocket Mini version of Rocknix. This is going to open up about 500 different PC ports that you can play on this device as well. So as you can tell, I am very excited about this. I tried testing it myself earlier today, but the bootloader that I have on my device is a little bit too old to be able to dual boot just yet. So I am waiting on an over-the-air update before I can do any testing myself, but I am very excited about this. And of course, as soon as we've got something to work with, I'll make a video about it to showcase how everything is working. Now, even though I would say the Retroid Pocket Mini doesn't really have any deal breakers, I do have some nitpicks about the device, so let's talk about some of the negatives. The first thing I noticed after my week of testing is that these face buttons are a little bit louder than I would like. They have a pretty clacky sound to them, and the fact that the device is a little bit thicker makes it sound a little bit hollow as well. Let me give you a listen comparing the Retroid Pocket Mini and the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, as well as the Nintendo Switch Lite. So yes, overall, I think you can hear that this is a louder experience, which means it might be annoying to your partner if you're going to be playing it in bed. It's still not the loudest buttons I've ever heard. I think that the Steam Deck is pretty close in that regard, but it is still very loud. Now, another thing I don't really like about the face buttons is the fact that they jut out a lot from the case. When I push the button all the way down, you can see there's still quite a bit of button remaining. And this I would say is above normal, and it just gives the buttons themselves a little bit less of a sturdy feeling. Here's a comparison against the Nintendo Switch Lite, which I would say is just about perfect when it comes to these types of buttons. So ideally I would want to push the button down about this much, not so much that it bottoms out against the case, but pretty close. And I would say the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro did a better job of this compared to the Retroid Pocket Mini. So I think that if the buttons were not quite this tall, or maybe the rubber membranes were not quite this stiff, I think it would be a better experience all around. Another thing that I purchased and I'm still waiting to deliver is the screen protector for this device, which goes across the entire front plate. So I'm hoping that adding this screen protector will actually make it a more pleasant experience with the face buttons. And finally, the last note I have about the buttons is that they seem to be scraping against the sides of the shell. You can see I have a little bit of white dust around each of my buttons, which is an indication to me that they are a little bit too tight. It hasn't really affected my gameplay, it's just something that I found to be a slight annoyance altogether. Another thing worth noting is that the fan noise, especially in the sport mode or the highest end mode, is a little bit louder than I would like as well. After testing it side by side with the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, I can tell you that it is quite a bit louder than the older device as well. Let me give you a quick audio demonstration between the high and low fan modes. Now thankfully, even though the fan is quite loud, I don't really find it to be that big of a deal because these speakers are super loud. In fact, I rarely will put it beyond like 40 or 50% because it does get that loud. Here's a quick sample of 50% volume to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. It sounds great. And finally, my last nitpick is also very small like the others, and that is that the SD card flap that goes over the SD card slot itself does not sit flush with the rest of the case. It doesn't matter what angle you use or how hard you push down on it, it's just going to stick out a little bit. Now I found it's not to the point where it's actually opening up, but it's just one of those things that's a little annoying. And the reason why this sticks out is because everything else on the device is very sleek except for this one SD card flap. So hopefully this is something that they can fix down the line, but at least with my review unit, yeah, it's a little bit annoying. Okay, so that's all the good and the bad with the device, and so you might be ready to pick this one up, or maybe not, and so let's now talk about this device compared to others. Now this is a very complicated thing, and I could probably spend an hour talking about each of these devices against the other, but instead I'm going to try to wrap this up as quickly as I can just using one big slide. So here I have a comparison against the Retroid Pocket Mini and a bunch of other devices that are under $300. My criteria here is that I wanted them to be horizontal handhelds and a little bit on the small side, and then yeah, again, also under $300. And so I put together a listing of the Retroid Pocket Mini and 7 other devices that probably would fall into that wheelhouse. From there, I looked at all the major systems that these devices can emulate and then did a tier ranking for each of them. So let's break down each of these, and also bear in mind that this is all subjective. It's only my own personal opinion after a few hours sitting and staring at these numbers. Let's use Game Boy and Game Boy Advance as our first example. For devices like the Anbernic RG40XXH and the Retroid Pocket 2S, these ones got a B grade. And that's because even though they do work out pretty well with those 4x3 systems, they also only have a 480p resolution. That means that scaling doesn't work out super well with these systems, and so you have to use things like shaders and overlays. Now when it comes to like the Retroid Pocket 4 and the 4 Pro, those also got a B ranking. That's mostly because they are 16:9 systems. This means you'll have pretty big black bars on the left and right when it comes to Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Now the RG Cube is a different story. That one has a 1:1 aspect ratio, which makes those Game Boy and Game Boy Color games look awesome. And I also think that the Retroid Pocket Mini deserves an A grade because this one has that AMOLED display, and because it's 4x3, it also doesn't have very big black bars. And then also because it has a higher resolution, that means that you don't have all the scaling issues that you have with a 480p display. Now let's look at Game Boy Advance for a couple other examples. This one also got a B grade for those first 2 systems, again because of the scaling issues and a 480p display. For the wider systems like Retroid Pocket 4 and 4 Pro, those look pretty good with a 3:2 aspect ratio system like Game Boy Advance. The RG Cube also looks very good because it can integer scale, even though it does have large black bars on the top and bottom. The Retroid Pocket Mini also does a very good job. Although it's not perfectly scaled, it is AMOLED, and also you have a lot of pixels to work with. But of course the iNeo Micro is basically perfect because it is a 3:2 display with a 4x integer scale. And even though the Retroid Pocket 5 is not out yet, I also anticipate this to be amazing as well because of that high resolution and the AMOLED display, which is 16:9. Moving on from there, let's talk about like 4x3 systems. So here I think the RG Cube is really good, especially with those devices that can run at an 8x7 aspect ratio like Super Nintendo. Same thing with the Retroid Pocket Mini. I found that this also, even though it's not perfectly scaled, can do wonders when it comes to 4x3 content. The AMOLED Micro also can do well if you do integer scale overscale, which I talked about in my review of that device too. Now I don't want to go through every device down the line, but you can kind of get an idea of why I made each of these rankings. And a lot of thought went into each of these, and so I know people are going to say, why did he make that decision? If you have any questions about it, let me know in the comments below. But essentially, when it comes down to it, looking at the Retroid Pocket Mini in particular, there are many S-tier rankings. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have an AMOLED display, but then also a 4x3 aspect ratio and a high resolution, which allows us to upscale and everything is going to look perfect. There are some systems that don't work so well with it, like we mentioned in this video. So Nintendo DS, 3DS, PSP, these all are not going to be a good match for a 4x3 device. So to put it all into one perspective, the idea here is that some devices are better with some systems and some devices are better with others. And I would say that some of these devices are better than the others when you put a specific context in mind. So next I want to break down where I think that each device is really going to shine compared to the others. We'll start with the Anbernic RG40XXH. If you're only going to be playing Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, 4x3 systems, and PS1, I think that this one might be the best of the bunch. And that has nothing to do with the aspect ratio or the screen, but mostly the price. This one is only $60 and you can usually find it on sale for cheaper. And so if you're looking for just a really easy way to get a 4-inch display to be able to play just those systems, I think that's the best entry point. Now along those same lines, I think the AMOLED Micro is the next one worth discussing. And that's because this one really shines with certain systems and kind of sucks with a lot of the others. But if you're only looking for really good Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and 4x3 retro systems, then the AMOLED Micro might be a good fit for you. I kind of liken it to the Analog Pocket, where that one only plays a certain amount of systems but does a very good job with those. And so if you don't mind paying upwards of $220+ for a device like this, but you want really good Game Boy Advance, that's where this one's going to fit. Next, let's talk about the Retroid Pocket 2S, and say you only want to play up to like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and maybe some arcade games, but you want it to be all around pretty good. And again, the cost is the major factor here. If you only want to spend $90 plus shipping, then I think this is going to be an excellent fit. The screen itself is a little bit on the small side, but for under $100, it's a pretty good deal. Likewise, the Retroid Pocket 4 is a pretty darn good deal, especially after this latest price reduction down to $135 plus shipping. If you only really want to play up through like PSP and maybe some Android games and some streaming, then this is going to be a really great fit. In fact, for PSP in particular, it's almost an S tier because it looks amazing on this screen. Moving down the line, we have the RG Cube, and I think this one is pretty good if you only want to play things like the older systems and maybe a little bit of GameCube and PS2. It's not going to be great when it comes to Sega Saturn or PSP or any of the modern systems like Switch or Android games, but if you are looking for something that's nice and compact with really good Game Boy and 4x3 systems, then this is going to be great. Now, if you're looking for something with more power than the RG Cube, especially when it comes to GameCube and PS2, then I think the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is the way to go. This device has that wider aspect ratio, which means you can use widescreen hacks and cheats for systems like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 to really fill out that screen. And this one gets really high marks with basically every system other than Nintendo Switch. I would say that one's not that great of a fit. But for everything else, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is an excellent all-arounder for under $200. And then of course we have the Retroid Pocket Mini, the subject of our video today. And you can see that this one has a lot of S tiers, and a lot of that again comes from the AMOLED display and the fact that it's 4x3 with a high resolution. So as long as you don't really plan on playing Nintendo DS, 3DS, PSP, and some of those 16:9 systems like Switch, this one is going to be an excellent fit for all those other systems. And so it's really going to come down to what you want to play. And then finally, of course, we have the Retroid Pocket 5. Now I don't have this one in hand, but we now know what the performance is going to be like because it's the same chipset as the Retroid Pocket Mini. And so given the fact that we're going to have that excellent performance plus an AMOLED display that's a little bit wider, that does mean that other systems like PSP and Switch and so on are going to play better. But of course, you have to bear in mind this one is going to be a larger device compared to the Retroid Pocket Mini, and so things like portability weren't really a factor when it came to this spreadsheet. And so without getting into the nitty-gritty of each of these little rankings, you can see that yes, as a whole, each of these devices do shine in their own way. And it's really up to you to determine which one is the most important to you and which price point makes the most sense as well. For my part, I am very happy with the Retroid Pocket Mini. I've been wanting a small, powerful 4x3 system for years, and I think this is really the first time we've truly seen one. And I am doubly excited about the fact that not only does it run really well on Android, it might be the first powerful Linux-based handheld as well. So in wrapping up, you might be wondering whether or not I recommend the Retroid Pocket Mini, and I think it's all really going to come down to that spreadsheet that we were talking about earlier. If all of those things that are important to you also matches the strengths of the Retroid Pocket Mini, then yes, I can say this is definitely worth $200. If you are specifically looking for 4x3 gaming, all the way up to GameCube and PS2, and if you don't mind having a screen that's a little bit smaller for the sake of portability, then yes, I think this is an excellent fit. But on the other hand, I'm also very excited to see the Retroid Pocket 5 in the next month or so. And that's because I think the Retroid Pocket 5 is going to be the more versatile between the two. In other words, I would say the Retroid Pocket Mini is a perfect little device for 4x3 retro gaming, but if you're looking for something that's more all-around best in class, then I think that the Retroid Pocket 5 might be worth waiting for as well. Anyway, let me know what you think of the Retroid Pocket Mini down below, and whether or not you're going to pick this one up or wait for the Retroid Pocket 5. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.